Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out my show. I really appreciate it. Please click to subscribe. There are more documents that are being unsealed and made public in the Bryan Kohberger case. New questions that are coming up. What did Bryan Kohberger's sister know that could have helped prosecutors? Bryan Kohberger's sister was on the prosecution's witness list. That is something new that we now know because that list has been unsealed. And I'm diving into what she may have known, why she may have been important to prosecutors. Also, someone on the defense list that's interesting, Dr. Catherine Ramsland, one of Bryan Kohberger's former professors. I actually did a very lengthy interview with her about Bryan Kohberger, which I'm going to have in this episode. And then also an update on the investigation in the prison where Bryan Kohberger is, the maximum security prison. Remember, there was the video that was leaked of Bryan Kohberger from inside, the latest on that investigation, and the fact that there will not be criminal charges. Why is that? I'm getting into all of this new information in this episode of Bryan Enton Investigates. Hey guys, so the witness lists are now public in the Bryan Kohberger case. Of course, there was no trial, there was the plea deal, we all know that, but the judge is slowly going over all of the documents and slowly making them public and releasing them. First, they have to go through and be approved by the defense and prosecution, and then the judge makes the ultimate call and is still releasing documents. And some of the documents that have been recently released over the last several days or so are the witness lists on both the defense and the prosecution side. And what I picked up on to be the most interesting with those lists, and first of all, there's a lot of names on there that I recognize that are just police officers and FBI agents and people involved in the case, but there are a couple that stood out to me. On the prosecution's list, Bryan Kohberger's sister, Amanda Kohberger, is listed, which is interesting because that means that for some reason, prosecutors were considering calling Amanda Kohberger, Bryan Kohberger's sister, during the trial as one of their witnesses. So there was a reason that they thought she could help their case. A couple of things that come to mind here. There was this issue with Bryan Kohberger's sister being charged with with Bryan Kohberger being charged with a misdemeanor back in 2014 for theft involving his sister and him stealing his sister's cell phone. You might remember Bryan Kohberger's dad, and I reported on this, I got the police report, called police back in 2014 and actually basically turned his son in. I guess he was trying to teach him a lesson or something like that for stealing his sister's cell phone. Perhaps did they want to bring that up at trial, and is that why they wanted to talk to Amanda Kohberger? We don't know, but that's one possibility. Also, his sisters were reportedly interviewed by police after Bryan Kohberger was arrested for the murders, and one sister reportedly, several different outlets reported this, including NBC, one sister said that she suspected Kohberger's involvement in the murders of the Idaho students, and even was looking at his car and things like that. Did they perhaps want to ask her about that, prosecutors, and is that the reason that they had her on the list? It's possible. I do think that's unlikely, though. I mean, that story never came up in any police reports that I saw. And also, since the plea deal, you've got Bill Thompson, the prosecutor, who's been doing a ton of interviews, and he said that he didn't believe that Kohberger's family had anything to help his case should he had called them to testify. Granted, did he really believe that? Is there something he's holding back? Amanda Kohberger was on the list. So in a second, I'm going to talk to Misty Maris. She's a friend of mine. She's an attorney who's been covering this case since the very, very beginning. She's very knowledgeable. She's going to explain what she thinks, why she thinks Amanda Kohberger was on the list. And she was also on the defense list, by the way, which is interesting. So I'm going to get to that in a second. Also new, and this is reporting from my buddy Kevin Fixer with the Idaho Statesman. Remember the video from inside the maximum security prison that was leaked out that shows Bryan Kohberger after he was booked into prison after the plea deal? And there was video that was leaked, which is, again, and I've said this before, it's a very big deal. I've never seen this happen before in my entire career. where video from inside a prison is leaked out. They told us that they were doing an investigation at the prison. Well, Kevin is reporting that no criminal charges will be filed against the corrections officer suspected of recording and releasing the prison security footage. So they have apparently narrowed down who they think that corrections officer is. That corrections officer no longer works at the high security prison, but there will not be criminal charges. And for a while, a lot of people thought there would be criminal charges, that violated some kind of law. That's not happening. I'm going to talk to Misty about that also. And lastly, in these new documents, the witness list that were released, on the defense list, I noticed a name that I'm very familiar with, Dr. Catherine Ramsland. Dr. Ramsland was Bryan Kohberger's professor at DeSales University in Pennsylvania when he was getting his master's degree in criminology. Why would the defense be interested in talking with Dr. Ramsland? Why would they have wanted to call her as a witness at the trial? Obviously, she was his professor, but what was she going to say that could perhaps help the defense? I did a lengthy interview with Dr. Ramsland. It's really the only interview she's done. I think she may have also talked to the New York Times, but it's one of the only interviews she's done since Bryan Kohberger pled guilty and went to prison, where she talked extensively about what she thought of Kohberger, about why she says she would want to study Kohberger and actually meet with him. So I'm going to play that interview for you too, which I think is interesting when you take into account that we now know she was on the defense list. But let me start out by talking to Misty about all of this. I'm joined now by Misty Maris, my friend and an attorney, and I haven't seen you in a while, Misty. Thank you for coming on. I thought of you when I saw this witness list, and I was wondering what you thought about it. The fact that Bryan Kohberger's sister, Amanda Kohberger, is on the prosecution's list. What comes to mind when you hear about that?
So, Bryan, first of all, so good to see you. And we obviously covered this case just, gavel to gavel all the way through. Ultimately, Bryan Kohberger's plea deal, which took a lot of us by surprise, although I know there was some buzz for the boots on the ground, which you were, that a plea deal might be coming down the pike. But when I see that his sister is on this list, this is something that I had opined around that time when it became clear that Kohberger was going to take a plea deal. And the question in my mind was why? Now, there were a whole bunch of blows to the defense as far as theories that could be used at trial. There was an alibi defense that could not be used. There were other defenses that Kohberger was not going to be able to raise. So all of that was a blow to the defense, but I would call it a predictable blow. The defense was really throwing everything they could at the wall to try and advocate for Kohberger and lay out a defense in the case, and they were not successful on a lot of that, keeping evidence out. So it was a predictable blow in my view. So I was wondering what else is going on. And I had thought that perhaps that there were family members who were going to end up on the prosecution's witness list, although I thought it could have been his father or his mother, because he had driven back with his father from the campus back to his home, and so many different things that they could have been witnesses to that may have been relevant for prosecutors. But it ended up being his sister. Now, if there was something that was going to tip the scales as far as a plea deal, it might be that his sister was going to have to testify for prosecutors. I also saw that she was on his witness list as a potential mitigation witness for sentencing. So, to the extent that there was an analysis by Kohberger about putting a family member in that situation, it could have been something that made an impact, because you and I both know the roll the dice at trial. This was going to be a if convicted, life in prison or death penalty, right? And why not roll the dice at trial? See if you can get one juror to hang that jury or whatever it might be. And then it takes decades for the death penalty to actually come to fruition, provided it was the worst case scenario for him. And the law on the death penalty is ever changing. We know that there's a lot of movement on that in every state. So you're talking, 20, 30 years down the line. Is that really the incentive taking that off the table, or was there something more? And perhaps this witness list is that something more that tipped that scale.
Yeah, and we've reported that his sisters were also interviewed by police, and there's one sister reportedly who said that she suspected Kohberger's involvement in the murder of the Idaho students, and that was also in the NBC Dateline piece. Do you think that that's true, and do you think that that could have come into play about why the prosecutors wanted to talk to her?
Certainly, it could have come into play why prosecutors wanted to talk to her. How that was actually going to make it onto the witness stand, if in fact there was testimony, it would really depend because from a defense perspective, you would challenge that as very speculative. What was the reasoning behind that conclusion that he was somehow involved? Does it have to do with something specific, or does it have to do with uh, mannerisms or something of the like? I think that we were on the doorstep of a trial, right, Brian? I mean, we were almost there. There were a lot of evidentiary decisions that had been made prior to the plea deal, but some of what was still up in the air would have been the scope of the testimony of certain witnesses. And as you know, when you're going into trial, you're putting witnesses on the list that you may call. You might not end up calling all of them, but you have to give notice to the other side if there's even a possibility that you may want to put them on the stand. So there's a little bit more of an analysis about what would have actually come out as far as testimony in front of a jury and whether or not it would have spoken to the heart of the issue or been too speculative and may have been something the defense could challenge as far as what types of questions they would answer.
Some people are speculating that because the witness list uh, came out, at least to the defense, the prosecution's witness list, just days before the plea deal, that it may have influenced Bryan Kohberger into accepting the plea deal. Would Kohberger have been able to see that witness list?
So he would be meeting with his attorneys in a case like this. And as a defense lawyer, you're obligated to share any relevant information with your client and how it might impact the case moving forward. So it's absolutely it would probably be a failure of the defense attorneys not to share at least who the witnesses are, why they might be relevant, and what impact it could have on the case. Keep in mind, this was a very lengthy witness list. Not that that's surprising in a case like this, as you know, the trial was going to be months long, right? That's how long it was anticipated to take to bring the case through trial. So it would absolutely be something that the defense would be sharing with Kohberger, speaking to him about, and to the extent that there were question marks about what somebody might testify to, getting insight from the client about how that might unfold, and then also, in addition to that, you're responsible from a defense perspective to tell your client what may be a problem for the case, what might be positive, because ultimately you make a recommendation as a defense lawyer, but it's the client that ultimately makes the decision on which way to proceed. They really drive the bus. So all of that would have been something that I believe, just from the way a defense usually unfolds, would have been shared with Kohberger around that time.
So the prosecutor, he's done a ton of interviews since the plea deal came out and everything was sort of settled. And he has said that he did not believe that Kohberger's family had anything really to help his case should he call them to testify. Do you think that's true, or do you think he knew something that he was sort of holding back, that he was debating? It's kind of like during the trial, can't they kind of make a game time decision?
Yeah, it's easy to say now that it's over, right? And to say that, oh, well, we were skeptical about calling them because we don't know. Number one, if you need them to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, that's always what prosecutors are looking for. What do we need to prove? And what witnesses do we need to put on the stand in order to do so? When you have a family member who is going to be, in some ways, from a prosecutor's perspective and analysis, it's a conflict. You might be dealing, it's your witness, but it might be a hostile witness, right? Because there's a familial connection, that there may be something that comes up in the testimony that you're not prepared for. All of those things are going to be factored into whether or not, in a risk reward scenario, is it worth it to put this person on the stand. So I do understand why prosecutors would say we're only going to use them if it is necessary for the case, Kohberger's family members, because there might be some risk to putting them on the stand. That being said, to your point, Bryan, you have all of these witnesses on the witness list, and to a certain degree, trial's predictable because you're exchanging information before you get into the courtroom. There's no Perry Mason or Matlock moments, although they seem like there are sometimes. Everything is exchanged in advance, but a trial is fluid, and you have to be able to pivot, whether you're the prosecutors or the defense, if there is something that needs to be established that has not been. So I think if we're really thinking about how this would have played out at trial, prosecutors would have likely kept those witnesses in their pocket and made a decision at some point throughout the trial whether or not they were going on to the stand, if they needed them for certain purposes, like timeline, where Kohberger was at a certain point, what communications were like, what was his demeanor like. We know a lot of evidence was gathered from the time frame where he was home with his parents ultimately. So that all could be relevant, and I think prosecutors were probably holding onto it in case they needed to use it at trial.
I one theory that I had about why they would want family members to testify is because they had a family Amazon account and they were trying to single out that he bought the K-bar knife on Amazon. Would they need the other family members to come up to just say, "Are you the one who ordered the K-bar knife? Are you the one who ordered this?" And then they would all say no, and basically through process of elimination, they could show jurors that it was Kohberger. That's kind of what I thought.
Yeah, and Bryan, you make a good point, and maybe it wouldn't even have been in the prosecutor's direct case, but when you have electronic records like that, you're going to have somebody who comes on from Amazon or from the company who says these are true and accurate records that are kept in the usual course of business, and go through and here's all the transactions and lay it all out. And a defense attorney on cross might say, well, even though it's on this account, can you tell who actually made the purchase?
Right.
Can you tell who hit the button, who put it in the cart? And the answer is going to be no, right? So you could see a case where on rebuttal, the prosecution fills in those holes by bringing the family members who also had access to the account to the stand and says, well, was this you, or was this you? And so that is exactly the type of scenario where maybe you're not anticipating, from a prosecutor's perspective, putting the family members on the stand in the direct case, but it may become necessary as the case unfolds, or in order to plug up some holes where the defense is trying to raise reasonable doubt.
One thing I've always been a little confused by is basically Bryan Kohberger's parents, which we've reported, were called before a grand jury in Pennsylvania on the death of another woman. It seemed like they were trying to rule Bryan Kohberger out of some of these other unsolved cases in Pennsylvania. But then the proceedings were used to elicit information about Kohberger's early years, and some of that information was going to be used by prosecutors in Idaho. What do you make of that? I mean, is that allowed? I guess that's allowed.
So, interestingly enough, I understand why his parents, when they were called before that grand jury, they tried to quash the subpoenas, meaning they tried to say that we should not have to testify before the grand jury because we don't have any relevant information. They were unsuccessful. So the rule is that grand jury material is secret. As we know, grand jury is behind closed doors, it's a prosecutorial process. But there are certain exceptions to that rule. And one of those exceptions is sharing information among law enforcement in the investigation of other crimes where whatever is in that grand jury proceeding could be relevant or is relevant to another investigation. Here's the general rule, Bryan, because this is important. So a grand jury proceeding cannot be for discovery purpose, meaning if you have somebody who's indicted, in this case it would have been Kohberger, you have an indicted defendant, you can't use another grand jury proceeding for the purpose of getting discovery material relating to that case. So you can't use it just to get additional information relating to another case. That is not permitted. And that's Supreme Court. It's a violation of the Sixth Amendment, violation of all sorts of other protections for criminal defendants. However, if there is another legitimate proceeding, another legitimate grand jury investigation, a legitimate reason, meaning another crime, then the grand jury proceeding can go forward. And to the extent there's some overlap or some question of overlap, it is valid and appropriate to ask those questions, to call witnesses. So that's where you get into kind of the gray area, right? What is the purpose? And that's really what the court asks. What was the primary purpose of this particular grand jury proceeding? So I think the reason that his parents were ultimately required to testify is that there was a legitimate grand jury proceeding going on with in relation to another case. They provided whatever information they provided that is validly shared with law enforcement. But whatever comes out of that, it's a question mark about whether or not it could actually come into a trial. Because whatever that information is would still be subject to all of the rules of admissibility that exist for any type of evidence that's going to come in. And that grand jury testimony is hearsay, actually, if a witness is available. So the way that I could see it actually making its way in is that it is under oath and it could be impeachment material. Meaning, his mom or his dad were to have taken the stand, whatever they said under oath before the grand jury could potentially be used to impeach them to the extent that there's something that wasn't consistent. It could also be the springboard for further investigation, and especially delving into his past and maybe finding out about other things that could potentially be relevant. And then it's a question about whether or not it actually is relevant to the case at hand, which prior bad acts and all of that type of evidence is subject to that same scrutiny of admissibility. A general rule, it doesn't come in unless there's an exception that it falls into. So I
Mm.
thought it was very interesting at the time. I get why they tried to quash those subpoenas because it felt targeted, right? But to the extent that there was a valid investigation going on, a grand jury proceeding relating to that case, it's above board from the perspective of the legal requirements.
What about there was a report, it was from back in 2014. I actually saw one of the police records where Bryan Kohberger's father told officers that his son had stolen his sister's iPhone, and there was a police report made about it. Do you think that's a reason they may have wanted the sister or or the family to testify at trial, the
Well,
prosecution?
and she, Amanda, that's the one that whose cell phone was allegedly or was stolen as per that police report, and she's the one that was on that witness list, right? So it could be. Uh, Without knowing more, it's a little bit questionable as to how that particular circumstance would come in as relevant to this case. But again, it is to the extent that there is material on the phone that might be relevant or that it relates to something that can be tied back to the actual case from a relevancy perspective. Possibly. I still think that you would have had a bit of a stretch there, and we didn't get all of those. We didn't get all of the decisions that would have been made by the judge about some of that evidence because we didn't ultimately make it to trial.
And just switching gears a little bit, Misty, I had covered when there, and maybe you have seen it, this surveillance video was leaked from inside the prison
Hmm.
since Bryan Kohberger, has been in this maximum security prison after the plea deal. And it was an intake area when he first came in. And the prison system said they were doing a big investigation. And now come to find out, they say that they likely know who the person is, but there are not going to be criminal charges against that jailer. Does that surprise you? I guess I sort of expected that they might want to charge that person because isn't that a huge violation?
Yeah, it certainly is a violation. And in their statement, public statement, they said they reviewed it. They really didn't feel like it fell into criminal conduct. And that's really the question is, do we have criminal conduct versus how does it relate to your employment? So he actually quit. The individual who leaked that footage quit before he would have inevitably gotten fired. I think that was absolutely going to be what was to come after the results of that investigation. But then the question is, do you move forward with criminal charges? And Bryan, to your point, when you have such a high profile prisoner and you have a massive leak like this and a massive violation, there is some incentive to say, well, this is going to be taken seriously, and this is something that that is going to be prosecuted to deter it from happening again. But it seems like ultimately in prosecutorial discretion, and that's, the way that this ends up, it's the question about whether or not prosecutors believe they can bring a case that they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. They decided not to. And I think that part of that is because the individual quit and maybe there was some type of, all right, you're going to go quietly and we're going to move forward. The other thing is, Bryan, we're talking about a very high profile case, and something that would come out in this investigation would be, were there other times that this has happened? If there were that were investigated internally, but maybe didn't make it into the public sphere, how were those treated? Were those people prosecuted? So there's an element of what we don't know that may have gone into that decision.
Appreciate Misty for talking with me and explaining a lot of that stuff. We may never know the answers to a lot of it. I mean, there was no trial. We may never know for sure why they had certain names on the list and what they may have actually been planning and what they had as plan Bs, and we may just never know. But I want to play for you now my interview with Dr. Ramsland. Again, she is Bryan Kohberger's former professor from DeSales University. Her name was on the defense witness list, which has now been made public. So Bryan Kohberger's defense attorneys were possibly going to call her as a witness at the trial. And I interviewed her just before the sentencing, so after the plea deal, when she felt like she could finally talk. And I just want to play for everybody again what she had to say. Renowned forensic psychologist, Dr. Catherine Ramsland. As you may know, she was Bryan Kohberger's professor and advisor at DeSales University in Pennsylvania. She has not spoken publicly about Bryan Kohberger until now. She's been on this show talking about other cases, but she's been very, very careful not to talk about Kohberger because of the trial, because she was going to be a witness at the trial, and she now feels comfortable to open up to us. And we've got so many questions, Dr. Ramsland, that I've got so many questions I've wanted to ask you for so long. I want to start with, how did you first meet Bryan Kohberger? What classes of yours was he in?
Okay, I want to be just clear that I'm still within the FERPA limitations that protect students and student information. So I will talk within that. I met him in the fall of 2018 when he came to DeSales University. He had an associate's degree and he was going to get into our 4-year program as a psychology major. He selected the forensic track, which made him an advisee for me because I managed the forensic track. And he was also in my class that semester.
And Dr. Ramsland talks about FERPA. I should have mentioned that. There's a law, it's a federal law, I believe, that she is not allowed to talk about certain aspects of a student, their grades, certain parts of their academic life. It's almost like a HIPAA. So she's going to tell us what she can, but unless Bryan Kohberger signs off, she's legally not allowed to talk about certain elements of his academic career. So just keep that in mind if there's some things that Dr. Ramsland can't answer. What was your perception of him?
He seemed like eager to be in the classroom. He was polite. He was respectful, intense, and curious. And there was no reason for me to think that he was anything other than someone who was really interested in this potential career.
Was there anything looking back now that was strange about him or that you noticed?
When I look back, there really isn't anything that stood out to me. I think when you're a teacher, your instinct is to accept students at face value. You don't, start with suspicions or, and there really weren't any red flags. He was always really quite respectful and grateful. He would thank me for things. He was attentive. He would do the work. I didn't have any concerns.
I think it was 4 classes that you taught him in. What were those classes?
There were 3 undergraduate courses in the forensic track that I taught, and he was in all of them. Well, one was Introduction to Forensic Psychology. Another was my death investigation class, which was called Psychological Sleuthing. And the third one was called Dangerous Minds, the Psychology of Antisocial Behavior. And then he got into the graduate program in criminal justice for a master's degree. And he took a course with me called Behavioral Criminology.
Is there anything, Dr. Ramsland, when you look back and you think about the curriculum of those classes, and not getting into his specific experience, but when you think about what you taught in those classes that you think, oh my gosh, he may have used that in what he's now accused of doing here in Idaho?
Well, the antisocial behavior course involves serial killers and mass murderers, and we do a lot of case analysis. I use two books that I wrote. One was written with the BTK killer, whom you just mentioned, and his decision process and the crimes and how he thought about them and felt about them and what was it like for him, to be caught. So that's a very intense book. And also I have one called The Mind of a Murderer, which was about various behavioral experts over the past century who interviewed killers, mass murderers, and serial killers to get as close as possible, spending a lot of time with them to get as close as possible to their process of becoming a criminal. And so he would have been exposed to that. I think now looking back, I would look at maybe some of the things that interested him as being, something that gives me pause. But we always have to think about, we all know, everyone in this field, forensic psychology and criminology, know that we could have students who might become offenders. But we also know that the vast majority of our students will not, and will instead go into a field like law enforcement, FBI, Secret Service, that make the world better, that protect us. So we know that there's always a risk that we're attracting somebody who wants to do something terrible. Hoping we won't ever have that, but in my case, I did.
Can you say, Dr. Ramsland, what it was looking back now that sort of raises your eyebrows specifically in terms of things in the class?
I think just the idea of wanting to study offenders and what their thought process was, how they felt about their crimes, wanting to study that, and then finding out that this is a person who then is now saying he's guilty of doing these things. I have to look at the framework of what I taught and wonder, did I inspire him in some way? Did I, but I can't second guess that, because I may have inspired somebody else to become an FBI agent. And that's, unfortunately, in this field, that's what we live with.
I mean, you've been studying serial killers most of your life, but when you talk about the fact that what you taught may have inspired this, that's got to be hard for you to process, I would imagine.
It's terrible, very hard. And it's not just what happened to the victims. I really thought Bryan Kohberger was a promising student. who really could have made a mark in this career in a very positive way. I thought that. So disappointed, angry, and very and shocked that this is who he turned out to be, and horrified for the victims and their families. Just horrified. I mean, I worked with Dennis Rader closely for 5 years. I met the victims' families. I saw the devastation that these kinds of acts can have, and I have to always keep that in mind when I'm teaching these subjects.
What did you think when you first heard that Bryan Kohberger, your former student, was arrested for this?
I was completely floored. I didn't believe it. And his demeanor that we saw on media was that he was confident that he was going to be able to prove his innocence. So I wanted to wait and see. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. But as months go by and he kept saying that he had an alibi, and I wondered, well, why are you sitting in jail? Give us your alibi, get out. And that wasn't happening. And then it was really when he said his alibi, and it was clearly not an alibi, and he would have known that, certainly from all the classes that he had through undergraduate and graduate work. He would have understood that wasn't really an alibi. I think that was when I was really, floored that this is my student who has done these things.
You mentioned, you studied BTK, the serial killer. You met with him many times in prison. This is what you do in a hope to prevent these things from further happening and understand the mind of a serial killer. Would you want to study Bryan Kohberger? Have you put any thought into that? Is that something that you think could be possible?
I've been thinking about that for 2.5 years. I would. This is my work. If he wanted to do that, I would. I know within the framework of this is what we do to try to look at developmental trajectories, the triggers, so that we can see the red flags faster. We can prevent people like this from wreaking the havoc that they do. So if he wanted to do that, I know that he's got the intellectual capacity to do it, to be self-reflective, to help think through how his life came to this. And so I would definitely do it if he were willing. And it would be hard. But I think because I have so much material from him, I have questions for him that I think nobody else but me could ask.
And just my last question, Dr. Ramsland, you are the person that I think of who, if anyone could see through someone and see that they have a secret side, I would think it would be you, because this has been your life's work and trying to figure that out. And in a sense, it almost feels like Bryan Kohberger even had you fooled.
Well, I study the ones who are really good at it because I want to truly try to understand what can we see in the constellation of behaviors that will tip us off earlier, because people who are really good at passing as normal and keeping their dark side hidden can fool people, can fool all the experts for a long period of time. I think anybody in my field will tell you they can be duped by a really skillful, predatory type of person. So, I'm not going to say I'm the person who can spot this. I can see things like if you have a rigid personality and you're threatening, those are red flags that are very clear. Or you have a mental instability and you're drawing, violent images. These are things we can see and we can anticipate. But if somebody's presenting themselves as a completely normal human being, engaged in life the way, that according to our expectations, it's really hard to see through that. And as a teacher, I am not initially suspicious that students are there for the wrong reasons. And so I think some of us have what I would call a cognitive disadvantage, because we are giving the benefit of the doubt to students. And I think that's certainly what happened. That's why I would want to work with him and study him, because I want to understand how he was able to completely fool me.
Well, it'll be interesting to see as this moves along, if that indeed ends up happening. Dr. Ramsland, appreciate you coming on tonight and sharing this insight into your former student. Thank you so much.